November 1st, 1918. The Meuse-Argonne offensive entered its final phase. American forces faced the Hindenburg Line, the last major defensive barrier before open country and the German border. Intelligence reports indicated that German morale was collapsing, that desertion rates had reached critical levels, that the end was approaching. But the Hindenburg Line itself remained formidable.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Concrete bunkers, interlocking fields of fire, artillery positions sited with mathematical precision, and manning those defenses were men who knew that behind them lay Germany itself. Whatever happened here would determine whether the war ended on French soil or German. Corporal James Mitchell had survived 6 weeks of combat since that morning in September when he first fired a shotgun in anger. He had watched the weapon transform from a novelty into a necessity, from something his squad looked at with skepticism into something they refused to advance without. The Winchester had become an extension of his body. He knew its weight, its balance, the exact pressure needed on the trigger to fire without jerking the barrel off target. He had learned to load it in darkness, to clear jams by feel alone, to estimate ranges by sound when visibility dropped to nothing. But he had also learned something darker. The shotgun changed you. Not physically, though the constant recoil had left bruises on his shoulder that never fully healed. It changed you mentally. When you carried a rifle, combat remained distant even at close range. You aimed at targets, not people. You squeezed a trigger and saw someone fall 200 yards away, abstract enough to process. But with a shotgun, there was no distance. You saw faces. You saw the moment of realization in their eyes when they understood what was about to happen. And then you fired, and those faces disappeared in a spray of red mist and bone fragments. Mitchell had stopped sleeping well in October. Not from fear. He had moved past fear weeks ago, but from memory. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those faces. German soldiers no older than himself, some probably younger, caught in trenches with nowhere to run, watching him approach with the shotgun and knowing exactly what came next. Some had raised their hands. Some had tried to surrender. Mitchell had let them when he could. But in the chaos of an assault, in trenches filled with smoke and screaming, surrender was not always possible. Sometimes you turned a corner and found an enemy soldier 2 feet away, and there was no time for anything except pulling the trigger. The nightmares always ended the same way. He would see one of those faces, bloodied and broken, and it would open its mouth and ask a simple question. Why? Not why did you kill me, not why did you fight, just why? Why this weapon? Why this way? Why did you choose to kill me with something that felt less like war and more like execution? Mitchell never had an answer. He would wake in the darkness, his hands shaking, and reach for the shotgun beside him. The cold steel under his fingers was the only thing that felt real. He was not alone in this. Throughout the American forces, soldiers carrying shotguns were experiencing something the medical officers did not yet have a name for. They called it battle fatigue, assuming it was the same condition that affected all combat troops. But there was a difference. Men who carried rifles could distance themselves from their kills. Men who carried shotguns could not. The weapon was too intimate, too visceral, too impossible to rationalize as merely the mechanical function of war. You killed with your hands, even if those hands held a weapon. And the knowing, the absolute certainty of what you were doing and to whom left marks that no amount of time would erase. On the morning of November 1st, Mitchell's unit received orders to assault a German strongpoint designated Hill 240. Intelligence.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Described it as a reinforced bunker complex with machine gun positions covering all approaches. Standard assault doctrine called for artillery preparation followed by infantry advance. But the artillery was needed elsewhere, supporting the main thrust towards Sedan. Mitchell's company would have to take the hill without preparatory fire. The captain who delivered the orders looked uncomfortable. He knew what he was asking. He knew the cost. But orders were orders, and the hill had to fall before nightfall. Mitchell checked his shotgun for the 100th time that morning. 6 shells in the magazine. Action smooth and clean. No rust, no fouling. He had 4 pouches of ammunition on his belt, each containing 12 shells. 78 rounds total. More than enough for any assault, assuming he lived long enough to fire them all. Around him, the rest of the squad prepared in silence. No jokes, no banter. They had been together since July and had learned that words before an assault were wasted. Save your breath for the fighting. The assault began at 1400 hours. No artillery, no smokescreen. Just 3 squads moving uphill through broken ground toward prepared positions. German machine guns opened fire at 300 yards, too far for shotguns to answer. Men went down. Mitchell kept moving, using shell craters and fallen trees for cover, always advancing, always closing the distance. The machine guns kept firing, steady and methodical, searching for targets. Bullets snapped through the air inches from Mitchell's head. He did not flinch. Flinching got you killed. Moving forward, even into fire, gave you a chance. At 100 yards, the machine guns intensified. Mitchell's squad was down to 7 men. The sergeant was hit, clutching his leg and screaming. Another private took shrapnel to the face and went down without a sound. But they were close now, close enough to see the bunker slits, close enough to watch muzzle flashes, close enough to matter. Mitchell pumped his shotgun and kept advancing. 50 yards. The machine guns could not depress low enough to hit them anymore. The German gunners had made a tactical error, sighting their weapons for long-range fire and leaving a dead zone close to the bunker. Mitchell and his remaining squad mates reached the blind spot and pressed against the concrete wall. They could hear voices inside, frantic Germans shouting, orders being given, someone calling for grenades. Mitchell did not wait. He moved to the bunker entrance, a narrow opening protected by a steel door that stood partially open. He could see movement inside, shadows shifting in the dim interior. He did not announce himself, did not call for surrender. He simply shoved the shotgun through the opening and fired. Once, twice, 3 times. The interior of the bunker lit up with muzzle flash. The booms echoed in the confined space, deafening. Screaming followed. Not the scream of men wounded in combat, but something higher, more desperate. Mitchell pumped the action and fired again, and again. The screaming stopped. He reloaded methodically, hands steady despite the adrenaline, and moved into the bunker. The interior was carnage. 7 German soldiers had been inside. 2 were dead instantly, their bodies torn apart by the first blast. 3 more were wounded so severely they would not survive the hour. The remaining 2 sat against the far wall, hands raised, faces white with shock. One was crying. The other simply stared at Mitchell with an expression that held no fear, no anger, just a kind of numb acceptance. Mitchell gestured with the shotgun toward the entrance. The 2 Germans stumbled out, still in shock, moving like automatons. Outside, the rest of Mitchell's squad had cleared the other bunker positions. The hill was theirs. Total time from the start of the assault to the final surrender, 11 minutes. American casualties, 3 dead, 4 wounded. German casualties, 18 dead, 6 wounded, 14 captured. The mathematics of combat favored the attackers overwhelmingly when shotguns were involved. But mathematics could not capture what those
11 minutes had cost the men who fought them. Mitchell sat on the edge of a shell crater and reloaded his shotgun. His hands were covered in blood, though he could not remember being wounded. He checked himself carefully and found no injuries. The blood was not his. It must have splattered when he fired into the bunker. He wiped his hands on his trousers, but the blood had already dried, sticky and dark. It would not come off. He would carry it back to the rear, into the rest area, into whatever came next. Physical evidence of what he had done. Private Daniel Foster, one of the men who had fought beside Mitchell that afternoon, sat down next to him. Foster was 19 years old, a farm boy from Iowa who had enlisted the day after his birthday. He had been carrying a shotgun for 3 weeks and had still not gotten used to it. He looked at Mitchell with eyes that seemed decades older than his face. "Does it get easier?" Foster asked. Mitchell did not answer immediately. He watched the sun beginning to set over the ruined landscape, casting long shadows across the torn earth. Smoke rose from a dozen fires. Bodies lay where they had fallen, waiting for burial details. The war continued somewhere else, artillery rumbling in the distance. But here, on Hill 240, everything was quiet. Peaceful, almost, if you ignored the dead. "No," Mitchell finally said, "it does not get easier. You just get more used to it, and that is worse." Foster nodded slowly, understanding. They sat in silence as darkness fell. 2 soldiers with shotguns, waiting for orders to move forward again, toward the next hill, the next bunker, the next group of men who would die because they were in the wrong place when American forces arrived with the wrong kind of weapon. Throughout early November, scenes like Hill 240 repeated across the entire front. American forces pushed forward relentlessly, and wherever they encountered fortified positions, shotguns cleared them. The German protest, the threats of execution, none of it mattered anymore. The war had its own momentum now, and it carried everyone forward regardless of laws or morality or fear. Soldiers on both sides stopped thinking about consequences and simply fought because fighting was all they knew how to do. But behind the lines, the diplomatic crisis continued to escalate. Germany had made its threat public, publishing the text of its protest in newspapers across Europe. The reaction was mixed. Some nations supported Germany's position, arguing that shotguns did represent an escalation of brutality that the laws of war should prevent. Others dismissed the complaint as hypocrisy from a nation that had introduced poison gas. Still others simply noted that after 4 years of unprecedented slaughter, arguing about which weapon was too inhumane seemed absurd. All weapons were inhumane. That was their purpose. The neutral press in Switzerland carried accounts from both sides. German newspapers published photographs of men wounded by shotgun blasts, their injuries on full display. The images were horrific: bodies torn open, limbs shredded, faces destroyed beyond recognition. The captions accused America of abandoning civilized warfare in favor of savage butchery. American newspapers responded with their own photographs, showing German gas attack victims, men blinded and scarred, lungs destroyed, dying slowly in field hospitals. The propaganda war mirrored the real war, each side claiming moral superiority while committing acts that undermined any such claims.
Himself in an impossible position. Military commanders in France demanded more shotguns, not fewer. Reports from the front consistently praised the weapon's effectiveness. Casualty rates in units equipped with shotguns were significantly lower than those relying solely on conventional weapons. From a purely military standpoint, the decision was obvious: continue deploying shotguns and save American lives. But from a legal and moral standpoint, the question was far more complex. If Germany executed captured American soldiers, the political ramifications would be severe. If America retaliated by executing German prisoners, the entire structure of international law governing warfare would collapse. Baker scheduled a meeting with his senior staff to address the crisis.
The meeting took place on November 4th, just 1 week before the war would end, though none of those present knew how close the end truly was. Present were representatives from the Judge Advocate General's office, military intelligence, the State Department, and senior combat commanders who had been recalled from France specifically for this discussion. The topic was simple. Should the United States continue deploying shotguns in combat, or should they be withdrawn to avoid the threatened executions? The legal representative spoke first. He argued that shotguns violated no existing treaty or convention. The Hague Rules prohibited weapons that caused unnecessary suffering, but defined unnecessary as suffering beyond what was needed to accomplish a military objective. A shotgun accomplished its objective, incapacitating enemy combatants just as effectively as a rifle or bayonet. If anything, it did so more quickly and with more certainty. The wounds were severe, yes, but no more severe than those caused by artillery, grenades, or bayonets. Germany's protest had no legal foundation. The State Department representative disagreed. Law, he argued, was not just about what was written in treaties, it was also about what the international community would accept. If every nation began deploying weapons that other nations found unacceptable, the entire system of laws governing warfare would break down. Germany's threat to execute prisoners was credible. If America ignored it, if American soldiers died because their government refused to withdraw an admittedly controversial weapon, the political consequences would be severe. Better to compromise now than to face a crisis later. The military commanders were blunt. Remove the shotguns and American casualties would increase. It was that simple. Soldiers in France were facing the most dangerous combat of the entire war, final assaults against prepared defensive positions. Every advantage mattered. The shotgun was saving lives, American lives, and no theoretical legal argument could outweigh that fact. If Germany executed prisoners, America would respond appropriately, but disarming soldiers in the middle of combat because the enemy complained was not an option. Baker listened to all sides and made his decision. The shotguns would remain in service. America would not be dictated to by German threats. If executions occurred, they would be treated as war crimes and prosecuted accordingly after the war. But American soldiers would not be denied effective weapons because their effectiveness offended enemy sensibilities. The meeting adjourned. The decision was made, and in France, soldiers continued carrying shotguns into combat, now with the full knowledge that their government had chosen their tactical advantage over diplomatic considerations. November 6, 1918. Corporal Mitchell's unit was pulled back from the front lines for rest and resupply. They had been in continuous combat for 8 weeks, and even by the brutal standards of the Meuse-Argonne, that was considered excessive. The rest area was a ruined village 10 miles behind the lines, far enough that artillery was only a distant rumble, close enough that they could be recalled to combat within hours if needed. Mitchell and his squad found shelter in what had once been a church. The roof was gone.
Most of the walls had collapsed, but 3 walls and part of the floor remained intact. Compared to trenches, it was luxury. For the first time in weeks, Mitchell had time to think. Time to process what he had experienced, time to confront the weight of what he had done. He sat on a pile of rubble that might have once been the altar and stared at his shotgun. The weapon showed the wear of constant use. The bluing was worn off in places from handling. The stock had scratches and dents, but mechanically it remained perfect. He had maintained it religiously, cleaning it every night no matter how exhausted he was. The shotgun had kept him alive. He owed it that much. Private Foster approached, carrying 2 canteens of water and a small package wrapped in brown paper. Mail call had come through, the first in 3 weeks. Foster handed Mitchell one of the canteens and the package. It was from Mitchell's mother, postmarked 6 weeks earlier. Inside was a letter, several pages in his mother's careful handwriting, and a small bag of hard candy. Mitchell ate one of the candies slowly, savoring the sweetness, then began to read the letter. His mother wrote about the farm, about his younger brother starting school, about the neighbor's daughter who had asked about him. Normal things, peaceful things. She mentioned that she prayed for him every night, that the whole town prayed for all the boys overseas, that everyone was so proud of what they were doing. She ended the letter with a simple line, "Come home safe. That is all I ask. Just come home." Mitchell folded the letter carefully and placed it in his breast pocket. He did not cry. He had not cried since July. But something inside him broke a little further. His mother thought he was fighting for something noble. She thought he was defending freedom, protecting civilization, making the world safe for democracy. She had no concept of what he actually did. She could not imagine him standing in a bunker entrance, firing a shotgun into the darkness, hearing men scream and die, and then moving on to the next bunker to do it again. And he could never tell her. Some truths were too heavy to share. Foster was reading his own letter, tears running down his face. His mother had written that his father was sick, possibly dying. Foster might not make it home in time to say goodbye. The war had taken that from him too. Not his life, but something equally precious. Time. The chance to be with family when it mattered. Mitchell put his hand on Foster's shoulder, offering what comfort he could. They sat together in the ruins of the church, two young men carrying weapons designed for slaughter, reading letters from home that reminded them they were still human. That evening, the company gathered for a briefing. The captain looked tired but relieved. He announced that German forces were collapsing across the entire front. Resistance was scattered and disorganized. Rumors suggested that Germany was seeking an armistice, that the war might end within days. The men received this news with quiet disbelief. They had been told the war would be over by Christmas in 1914, then 1915, then 1916, then 1917. Promises of peace had become meaningless. But the captain insisted. This time was different. The German army was finished. The end was coming. Mitchell wanted to believe it, wanted to imagine laying down the shotgun and never picking it up again, wanted to return to Pittsburgh and work in his father's shop and forget everything he had seen and done. But he could not quite grasp it. The war had become his entire existence. Combat was normal. Peace was the fantasy. He had forgotten what it felt like to sleep without expecting to wake to artillery fire. He had forgotten what it felt like to be around civilians who had never seen death. He had forgotten how to be anything except a soldier with a shotgun waiting for the next assault.
Firing a shot. White flags appeared on fortifications that had resisted for years. Officers crossed into American lines requesting terms. The collapse was total and absolute. After 4 years of stalemate, the end came with shocking speed. Mitchell's unit was advancing through territory that had been German-held just hours before. They encountered no resistance. Villages that intelligence had marked as fortified were empty. Trenches stood abandoned, equipment left behind as if the occupants had simply vanished. It felt surreal, walking through enemy positions unopposed, seeing the same mud and wire and misery from the other side. The Germans had lived in the same conditions, suffered the same hardships, died in the same ways. The only difference was which side of the wire they stood on. In one abandoned bunker, Mitchell found a journal written in German. He could not read the language, but he recognized the format. Daily entries, sketches in the margins, names and dates. Another soldier's record of the war, just like the journal some American soldiers kept. Mitchell flipped through the pages, looking at the drawings. A landscape. A portrait of a woman, probably a wife or sweetheart. A small dog. Ordinary things that the author would never see again. Mitchell left the journal where he found it. It was not his story to carry. November 10th, 1918. Official word came down. An armistice had been signed. The fighting would cease at 1100 hours on November 11th. The war was over. Mitchell received the news with the same quiet disbelief as everyone else. After 4 years of the most savage conflict in human history, it was simply going to stop. No final climactic battle, no grand surrender ceremony. Just an agreed-upon time, and after that time, the guns would fall silent. The night of November 10th was strange. Men who had been fighting for years suddenly had nothing to do. Some celebrated, drinking whatever alcohol they could find, singing, shouting. Others sat in silence, unable to process the enormity of what had happened. Mitchell cleaned his shotgun one last time, working methodically through the familiar routine. He would not need it after tomorrow. The thought felt impossible. The shotgun had been his constant companion for 5 months. It had kept him alive when rifles and grenades would have failed. And now it was just a piece of metal and wood, its purpose fulfilled, ready to be crated up and shipped back to some armory where it would gather dust until the next war. Foster asked Mitchell what he would do when he got home. Mitchell thought about it. He had not allowed himself to plan for survival. Planning implied hope, and hope in combat was dangerous. But now, with the end so close, he let himself imagine. He would work in his father's shop. He would marry the neighbor's daughter if she would have him. He would have children and tell them nothing about the war except that it was over and they were safe. He would never touch a shotgun again. November 11th, 1918. 1100 hours. The gun stopped. No fanfare, no ceremony, just silence. After years of continuous artillery fire, the silence was deafening. Men stood in their positions, unsure what to do. Some climbed out of trenches and stood openly, marveling that no one shot at them. Others wept. Some laughed hysterically. The reactions were as varied as the men who experienced them. Mitchell stood in a field that had been no man's land just hours before. The ground was torn and scarred, littered with debris and the remnants of battle. But the fighting was over. He looked at the shotgun in his hands one last time, then slung it over his shoulder. The war was done. He had survived. Against all odds, despite carrying the most controversial weapon of the entire conflict, he was going home. But as the days passed and the initial relief faded, Mitchell began to understand that while the fighting had stopped, the war had not ended. Not for him. Not for any of them. They carried it with them. In memories, in nightmares, in the weight of what they had done and could never undo.
Understand yet. Ways he would spend the rest of his life trying to reconcile. The processing of prisoners and the occupation of Germany began immediately. American forces moved eastward, crossing the Rhine, establishing control over territory that had been enemy soil just days before. The German population received them with a mixture of fear and relief. Fear, because propaganda had portrayed Americans as brutal occupiers. Relief, because occupation meant the war was truly over, that the suffering would stop. Among the first tasks facing American forces was dealing with German complaints about American conduct during the war. The shotgun protest had never been resolved. Germany had threatened executions, but never carried them out. With the war now over, the question became whether Germany would seek to prosecute American soldiers retroactively for carrying illegal weapons. The answer came quickly. Germany had no interest in further conflict. The protest was quietly dropped. No American soldier would face trial. No executions would occur. The shotgun controversy simply faded away, overtaken by larger concerns about occupation, reconstruction, and the peace treaty being negotiated in Paris. But the controversy did not disappear entirely. In military circles, debates continued about the role of shotguns in warfare. Some argued they should be standardized issue for all assault troops. Others maintained they were specialty weapons, useful in specific situations, but not replacements for rifles. The U.S. military compromised, maintaining a stock of shotguns but not making them universal issue. They would remain available for future conflicts, but would not become the primary weapon of the American soldier.
The German military conducted its own analysis of the shotgun's effectiveness. Despite their public protests, German officers privately admitted the weapon had been devastatingly effective in close-quarters combat. Some advocated for Germany to develop its own shotguns for future use. Others argued that the psychological impact was too severe, that soldiers equipped with shotguns suffered higher rates of combat fatigue and post-traumatic stress. The weapon was effective, they concluded, but at a cost that extended beyond the immediate battlefield. For the soldiers who had carried shotguns, the return home was complicated. Most simply wanted to forget. They packed away their uniforms, avoided veteran gatherings, and tried to rebuild normal lives. But forgetting proved impossible. The memories stayed vivid. The faces of men they had killed remained clear. And the question, the one that Mitchell had never been able to answer, stayed with them. Why had it felt different? Why had the shotgun, more than any other weapon, left such deep scars? Psychologists who studied combat trauma in the decades after the war identified a pattern. Soldiers who had engaged in close-quarters combat with edged weapons or shotguns showed higher rates of psychological distress than those who fought at range with rifles or artillery. The theory was that distance provided psychological protection. Killing someone 200 yards away with a rifle allowed the mind to maintain separation between the action and the consequence. But killing someone 10 feet away with a shotgun made that separation impossible. You saw everything. You knew exactly what you had done. And that knowledge was corrosive. Mitchell returned to Pittsburgh in December 1918. His family welcomed him with joy and relief. The neighbor's daughter, whose name was Anna, had waited for him. They were married in March 1919. Mitchell took over his father's metalworking shop and settled into civilian life with determination. He never spoke about the war. When veterans gathered to share stories, he stayed home. When parades were held to honor returning soldiers, he watched from a distance. He wanted nothing to do with remembering. But the nightmares continued. 2 or 3 times a week, Mitchell would wake in darkness, heart pounding, seeing faces he could never forget. Anna
learned not to wake him during these episodes. She would wait until he calmed himself, then hold him without asking questions. She knew something terrible had happened to him overseas. She knew it had changed him. But she also knew that he would never tell her what it was, and that pushing would only drive him further into silence. In 1923, Mitchell's first son was born. He named the boy Thomas after his father. Holding his son for the first time, Mitchell made a silent promise. This child would never know war, would never carry a weapon, would never face the choices Mitchell had faced. Whatever it took, however much he had to sacrifice, his son would be spared. It was the only way Mitchell knew to make meaning from what he had experienced. Foster, Mitchell's squadmate, did not adjust as well. He returned to Iowa and tried to resume farming, but the work felt meaningless. He drank heavily, trying to drown memories that would not fade. In 1921, he took his own life. His family never understood why. They only knew that something in France had broken him and that he had never been able to put himself back together. The official statistics told part of the story. American forces had deployed approximately 5,000 shotguns during the final months of the war. Units equipped with shotguns showed casualty rates 30 to 40% lower than units without them. Estimated lives saved between 3,000 and 5,000 American soldiers. German casualties inflicted by shotguns were harder to calculate, but estimates ranged between 15,000 and 20,000 killed or wounded. From a purely military standpoint, the shotgun had been a success. But statistics could not capture the full cost. The psychological toll on men who carried shotguns was severe and long-lasting. The ethical questions about weapons that crossed lines of acceptable brutality remained unanswered.
The diplomatic incident had damaged American relations with Germany at a crucial moment when cooperation was needed for reconstruction. And the precedent, the idea that any weapon was acceptable if it saved lives, would echo through future conflicts with troubling implications. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, made no mention of shotguns. The weapons were not banned, no restrictions were placed on their future use. The German protest had failed legally and diplomatically. But in a sense, Germany had won a moral victory. The international community recognized, even if it did not officially acknowledge, that shotguns represented a level of brutality that made even hardened soldiers uncomfortable. Future conflicts would see their use, but sparingly, always with the knowledge that they occupied a gray area between legitimate warfare and something darker. In the United States, the shotgun controversy faded from public consciousness quickly. The war ended, soldiers came home, the nation moved on to new concerns: prohibition, women's suffrage, economic growth. The brutal details of trench warfare became stories told by aging veterans, and then memories that died with them. The shotgun became just another weapon in the arsenal, unremarkable and forgotten. But for those who had carried them, who had felt the recoil and heard the screams and seen the damage, the shotguns remained unforgettable. They represented not just a weapon, but a moment in history when warfare had reached a level of brutality that seemed to exceed all previous bounds. They were symbols of what men could do to each other when survival demanded it. And they were reminders that even in war, some victories came at costs that could never be fully calculated. Mitchell lived until 1964, dying of heart failure at age 68. Near the end, when Anna thought he was sleeping, she heard him whisper something. She leaned close to hear. He was repeating a single word over and over. Sorry. She never knew who he was apologizing to or what he was apologizing for, but she understood that whatever burden he had carried from the war, he had carried it alone, and it had never let him go.
Model 1897 shotgun remained in U.S. military service until the 1960s, seeing use in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. Each conflict added new stories, new controversies, new debates about whether such weapons had a place in modern warfare. But none of those later stories captured the same intensity as the original controversy in 1918, when the weapon was new and the world was still learning what total war truly meant. The legacy of the trench shotgun is complex and contradictory. It saved lives. It also traumatized those who used it. It was effective. It was also brutal beyond what many considered acceptable. It represented American ingenuity and practical thinking. It also represented a willingness to cross lines that others were not willing to cross. In the end, the shotgun became a mirror, reflecting not just the nature of combat, but the nature of those who fought. And what it reflected was not always comfortable to examine. Today, shotguns remain in military and police arsenals worldwide. They are used for breaching doors, for crowd control, for close-quarters combat in urban environments. They are considered tools, weapons like any other, unremarkable in their presence. But for historians who study the First World War, the trench shotgun controversy of 1918 remains a fascinating glimpse into how warfare changes, how societies adapt to new forms of violence, and how even in the midst of total war, questions of morality and legitimacy still matter. The men who carried shotguns in the trenches of France are gone now. Their stories, for the most part, died with them. What remains are official records, casualty statistics, diplomatic protests, and a few scattered personal accounts. These fragments allow us to reconstruct what happened, but they cannot fully convey what it meant to those who lived it. We can know that shotguns were effective. We can understand that they saved lives, but we cannot truly grasp what it cost the men who carried them, what they sacrificed in the process of surviving, what they lost even as they won. Perhaps that is the final lesson of the trench shotgun, that in war, every advantage comes with a price. Every weapon that makes killing more efficient also makes living with that killing more difficult,
and that the true cost of combat is measured not in battles won or casualties inflicted, but in the weight carried by those who survived, the memories they cannot escape, and the questions they can never answer. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.